When people think of World War I, they imagine the trenches of France, the thunder of artillery, and the crumbling empires of Europe. But the spark that could have ignited the war years earlier didn't start in Europe's heartland. It began on a frozen border between two old rivals. Long before the first shots were fired in 1914, a line on a map nearly pulled Britain, Germany, and Russia into a global conflict no one was ready for. This is the story of the border that almost started World War I. At the turn of the 20th century, Europe looked like a powder keg with borders as its fuse. The great powers were locked in a constant race, not just for colonies, but for territory itself. Every mountain pass, every river, every coastline mattered. The most fragile of these lines was the one between the Russian Empire and its western neighbors. It was a frontier so vast that no one truly knew where it ended. And that uncertainty almost changed history. After the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, Germany emerged as a new superpower under Otto von Bismarck. The unification of the German states had rewritten Europe's balance of power, but it also created a nightmare for diplomats. Two empires, Germany and Russia, now shared a border stretching across thousands of miles of plains, forests, and disputed lands. For centuries, that border had been redrawn by conquest, rebellion, and shifting alliances. And by 1900, both sides had started building armies as if war was inevitable. The key flashpoint lay in a region most people today have barely heard of: East Prussia. It was a strip of land jutting into what was then the Russian-controlled territories of Poland and Lithuania. To Berlin, it was sacred German soil, the birthplace of generals and the legacy of the Teutonic Knights. To Russia, it was an open invitation, a vulnerable flank that could be struck in days. Both sides fortified it relentlessly, each claiming they were defending peace. The paranoia grew as railways began to spread. In the late 1890s, Germany built the Ostbahn, the Eastern Railway, a high-speed military supply line connecting Berlin directly to the frontier. Russia responded with its own network of strategic railways linking St. Petersburg and Warsaw to its western edge. Each new station brought troops closer to the border. Every bridge built in peacetime looked like a war waiting to happen. In 1905, the first real crisis hit. While Russia was reeling from defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, German military leaders saw an opportunity. They believed Russia was weakened, demoralized, and unable to defend its borders. Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered war games near the frontier, moving thousands of troops and heavy artillery to test readiness. Russian generals panicked. Intelligence reports claimed, wrongly, that Germany was preparing a full invasion of Russian Poland. For 2 days, Russian frontier guards mobilized along the line, and artillery units aimed westward. Newspapers in Berlin and St. Petersburg screamed of imminent invasion. Then, just as quickly as it started, the tension faded. No shots were fired, but both sides came away convinced that the other had been ready to strike. By 1908, the fear had turned into a policy. Germany began constructing what became known as the Ostwall, or Eastern Wall, a line of fortresses stretching from Königsberg to Thorn, designed to stop a Russian advance. Russia, not to be outdone, started expanding its own fortifications near Kovno, Grodno, and Osowiec. Each fort faced the other like a loaded gun across a table. Diplomats tried to calm things, but generals on both sides had already decided that this border would be where the next Great War began. Then came the incident that nearly made that prediction come true. In the spring of 1912, a German survey team working near the Masurian Lakes region accidentally crossed into Russian territory while mapping drainage canals. The group, 6 engineers and 2 army officers, were detained by Russian border guards. When questioned, one of the officers refused to hand over his papers, claiming diplomatic immunity. Shots were fired. 2 men were wounded, and both sides accused the other of firing first. Within hours, Berlin demanded their release, calling the arrest an insult to the empire. St. Petersburg refused, claiming the men had been conducting military reconnaissance. For a tense week, Europe stood on edge. German newspapers printed maps showing Russian aggression, while Russian papers described the Germans as spies disguised as engineers. Troop trains began to move toward the frontier again. Britain, France, and Austria-Hungary, each tied by alliances, quietly prepared for what looked like a possible chain reaction. The British ambassador in Berlin wrote, "One bullet on the frontier may ignite all of Europe." It nearly did. What stopped it wasn't diplomacy, it was embarrassment. When the detained Germans were finally interrogated by Russian officials, it turned out they really were surveyors. Their maps matched official land registry data, and the supposed military plan plans were just drainage blueprints. Faced with the truth, both governments quietly agreed to release the men and pretend it never happened. But by then, the damage was done. For the first time, Europe had seen how fragile peace truly was. Behind the scenes, military planners on both sides took the near crisis as a rehearsal. Germany's general staff began developing what later became the Schlieffen Plan, a blueprint for invading both France and Russia in a two-front war. The Russian High Command responded with its own Plan 99, which outlined a massive offensive into East Prussia if war ever broke out. Both strategies were built around the same assumption, that the border dispute had made peace temporary. The next incident, they believed, would not end with apologies. By 1913, even civilians along the frontier could feel the tension. Entire villages were quietly evacuated to make room for troop encampments. Farmers plowing fields near the border found warning signs reading Imperial Military Zone. Patrols doubled. Every foggy morning, locals reported seeing figures in the mist, soldiers from both sides accidentally crossing invisible lines. Most of the time, they just waved, shouted a few words, and retreated. But each of those brief encounters was a reminder. The world was waiting for one mistake. Ironically, the spark that finally lit the war didn't happen on this border at all. It came hundreds of miles south in the Balkans, with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in June 1914. But when the news reached East Prussia, the reaction was instant. German and Russian troops both went to high alert. Telegrams flew back and forth warning of mobilization. The same generals who had faced off during the 1912 border scare were now preparing for the real thing. When war was finally declared that August, East Prussia became one of the first battlefields. Russian armies crossed the border within days, marching into the territory they had once feared to enter. The German counterattack came at Tannenberg, one of the most famous battles of the early war, in the same region where that survey team had been arrested just 2 years before. The frontier that had almost started World War I ended up helping define its beginning. What's remarkable is how close the world came to starting that war early, over a handful of mistaken maps. Historians later calculated that if Germany or Russia had mobilized fully during the 1912 incident, the chain reaction through their alliances could have triggered a global conflict 2 years ahead of schedule. In that scenario, Britain and France would have been forced to act sooner, while the Ottoman Empire might have remained neutral. The result, a completely different war. One that might have ended with a different Europe entirely. Today, the old East Prussian frontier is gone, erased by modern borders that divide Poland, Lithuania, and Russia's Kaliningrad region. The lakes and fields that once marked the edge of empires are now quiet, dotted with small villages and memorial stones. But if you walk those paths, you can still find fragments of the old forts, crumbling concrete, rusted rail lines, and moss-covered watchtowers, reminders of how one invisible line almost reshaped the world before it even began. The story of that border is a lesson in how wars rarely start with declarations or grand speeches. More often, they begin with confusion, a wrong turn, a crossed line, or a single misunderstanding between men who never wanted to fight. The border between Germany and Russia almost taught the world that lesson early. Instead, it waited just long enough for history to repeat it on an even greater scale. In the end, the frontier that almost started World War I became a symbol of the fragile peace that existed before 1914. A peace built not on trust, but on fear. A peace where every map was a potential trigger and every patrol carried the weight of history on its shoulders. And when that peace finally broke, it wasn't the border that caused it. It was everything that border represented: pride, paranoia, and the dangerous illusion that control could be drawn with a line on a map.